thank you so much for, first of all, accepting the invite and coming onto the show. So maybe to just give context to our viewers who will be watching this episode. So the channel is taking a direction in the month of June to really understand the state of fatherhood, and which obviously ties into masculinity in South Africa. And part of what I've been doing is speaking to different people who've been looking at the different aspects of fatherhood. And that's why Felicity is here. So the first thing I just wanted to start off with is a proper intro of yourself. I mean, I've mentioned your name, but I think it's very important that you, for yourself, introduce yourself and just sort of take us through the journey that's led you to this point.
Sure. So, I got separated 13 years ago for the second time, second marriage ending, and I came into this space from a very different perspective. I was a lot older, aware of a lot more, and my journey is very extreme, but be that as it may, it created I started a Facebook group in 2014, which is 10 years old, called Child Maintenance Difficulties in South Africa.
Right.
But it wasn't only about maintenance. So over the last 10 years, it has provided some very interesting research material, because there's 85% women and 15% men on there, but it wasn't just about maintenance, it was about co-parenting. And over a period of time, many years, I recognized particular patterns. And that's what made me curious about establishing more about these patterns, because it was irrespective of culture, religion, race, socioeconomics, the behavior was very similar. So that's, we have these problems, but if we don't understand them, we're never going to shift the needle. So I think that's what made me interested in behavior. So, over the last couple of years, a lot of my focus has been on behavior, patterns of behavior, individual patterns, collective patterns, gendered patterns, because therein is the answers to our problems that we're experiencing.
And on that, I think when we talk of, I like what you mentioned about, patterns of behavior being what they are regardless, right? Because the stats speak for themselves, right? So on this particular issue of maintenance, what I would like to start off with is maybe in very simplistic terms. I know it's a very complex thing to unpack for people who are not aware of how the process works in South Africa currently, right? So basically, a man and a woman get together, they have a child. So whether in marriage or outside of marriage, and for whichever reasons that relationship doesn't work out, right? And because we are both the parents of this child, we obviously have obligations or responsibilities for the upkeep and maintenance of this child. Now, what's happening in our country, at least from the research that I've read and the State of Fatherhood report that you contributed to, is there seems to be an inherent disconnect when it comes to the last part of maintenance. So could you describe the process of what it currently looks like for a woman to even figure out where does she need to go to make a maintenance claim? How does that process work? How does the justice system come into place? And all of that, just to lay the framework for the rest of our discussion.
Sure. So if there is no maintenance agreement in place, and those normally occur through divorces as a matter of part of the process to get a divorce, you have to have a maintenance agreement. But our stats show us that 60% of children are born out of marriage. So what that means is we have far more people approaching the court directly to get a maintenance agreement. So the applicant would approach the court and apply for maintenance. They would complete a form, and that form is basically the child's expenses as well as what the mother's income is and what her contribution to those expenses are. So the objective is to get the other parent to come to court. And we use the word court, and I think that's part of the problem, because you don't
Right.
actually appear in a court. You appear in an office with a judicial official called the maintenance officer, who facilitates in an inquisitorial process to establish what the child's needs are and what the parents' means are to contribute to the child's needs. So ideally, how it should work is that there's full disclosure of income, and the children's expenses are evidence, so there is proof of all of the children's expenses. And then, are you there? I lost you.
Yes. I lost you at actual evidence of expenses. Are you guys still with me?
Yes. Okay. So based on the evidenced expenses of the child, then
Yeah.
according to a specific formula, the maintenance officer is to come to a acceptable amount, and that is, the Maintenance Act says proportionate to income based on expenses that is fair and reasonable. So our
Right.
Maintenance Act looks at the 5 essentials, and that would be shelter, clothing, education, healthcare, and food. Those are the basics. But obviously, there's things like, with education would be transport to school. Shelter is, the child's shelter, wherever that is, needs to be covered as well. And then it's not 50-50, it's based proportionate to your earnings. And in South Africa, men still generally earn a lot more than women, although that needle is shifting. So it
Right.
should be assumed that the father, who's normally the non-primary parent, would contribute more to the expenses. But again, what needs to be taken into account is how many children does the father have? Because there could be
Right.
children from previous relationships and
Right.
new relationships. So our Act also allows for all children, irrespective, to be treated equally. So that doesn't necessarily mean they all get the same amount, but if one child is going to a private school, then morally and legally there's provision for all the children to be able to go to private schools. But
Correct.
that depends on one's means. So the Act does cover those kind of things.
Okay.
And then it is the maintenance officer would put that amount forward, and if both parties consent, then a consent agreement form is signed and it's taken to the magistrate, and the magistrate then makes it a court order,
Okay.
after establishing that they both understand that. If they don't consent, then a financial inquiry has to be done. Often what is raised at that point is paternity. So paternity has to be established, and then a financial investigation done, and then it would go to a Section 10, which is in front of a magistrate, for the magistrate to determine what the amount is. But most of them are resolved in the office. And yeah, I mean, these are discussions that really need, we can take each layer and unpack those. But in a nutshell, that's what the process entails.
Well, firstly, off the bat, sounds like a very daunting process, right?
Yep.
And you need quite a bit of access to that information to even know that you have that process at your beckoning. So on that, one of the things I would want to do, just so the viewers are aware. So Felicity was a contributor to this report, which is basically, I don't think a lot of people know this, but yes, there is research into the state of South Africa's fatherhood, and this is a 2021 report. So, um, based on the framework that you've set for us in terms of the process, I'd like to just quote from some stats from the paper that you contributed to. The title of the paper says Mothers' Difficulties in Securing Child Maintenance, Financial Abuse as a Form of Domestic Violence. And we will get into financial abuse is a form of violence later on. What I want to quote is, it says, in 2019, there were over 12.4 million, which is 64%, children who received the CSG, which would be our, child security grant in South Africa. Most children did not live with their biological fathers, right? And 63% of fathers' names were missing from birth certificates. Now, my question to you, based on these stats, is if at face value from what you've described, the process is quite a laborious process. If the father is not even on the birth certificate, right? How do mothers even begin the process, right, of going through being able to claim for maintenance and all of this kind of stuff? And what measures are in place, first of all, to even drive the education for mothers to know that there is that recourse, if the father is no longer around, or has even passed away, right? Because if he's passed away and he's not on the ID certificate, on the child's birth certificate, how does that work?
So, yeah, I'm amazed that, and I see this on my group that has over 85,000 people on, that often the question pops up, all I have is his cell phone number and he's blocked me. Because in the event of that, where do you begin? So, and I mean, to really understand this, so that speaks to the kind of relationship that the child is conceived in, okay? But even if the name of the child's father, if it's not on the birth certificate, very few have their ID number. So if we look at tracking and tracing, without an ID number, it's very difficult to track and trace anybody for anything in this country. So, like, without sounding cynical, this is part of the education, is that if you're going to have a relationship with somebody and it develops into a sexual relationship, at least have their ID number. At least know where they live and where they work and where their family is, because the courts can subpoena anybody as a witness to provide information that they need. So in the absence of all of that, and I mean, a lot of parents, a lot of mothers do not have that information. And unfortunately, the onus is then on them to try and find the father to get that information. If they have that information, then they can provide it to the courts, and the courts have maintenance investigators who have access to ITC, etc., e-natus, and all of that, to be able to punch in the ID number and to retrieve that information. They, in fact, even with cell phone providers, they can punch in the cell phone number and retrieve, like, all of that information. But, change your cell phone number and you're back to square one again. So these are some of the barriers into getting child support. And with regards to, sorry, your second question was?
Sorry, I lost you there.
Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
So I was asking then if, I mean, you already answered it, because I was trying to understand then if that basic information isn't there, what can a mother do to ensure that the father takes responsibility, right? Even though the relationship between them has ended, there's still a child that needs to be taken care of, and I think you've answered that if that basic information isn't there, it's very difficult. Now, I know that the scope of your work is more related towards the maintenance part, but in your interactions and the work that you've done, when we come to the root core, or part of what starts the problem, what do you believe, in your opinion, is part of the reason why these relationships deteriorate to the point where the reality is there's a child that's been abandoned?
So I think if we just start from a build on what we've been discussing, with approximately 60% of fathers' names omitted from birth certificates. And my research shows me that there's several factors. One is a cultural factor, is
Right.
that fatherhood has not been acknowledged, and or paternity has not been acknowledged to the family, and the family then feel disrespected, and they don't
Mhm.
acknowledge him as the
Right.
father of the child. I've had many conversations with women who've told me that despite them not having paid damages, that they want to now pursue maintenance, and that the maternal family have said, if you go off, we will not support you because we have been disrespected as a family. So I think it's important to mention that, because often
Mhm.
women just get blamed for this, but it's part of a broader
Right.
social issue
Yeah.
than just the mother not wanting to put the father on the birth certificate for malicious reasons. The other
Right.
one is that with the laws that have changed, so if you put the father's name on the birth certificate, when you register your child for schooling, when the child requires a major operation, should you be able to travel, you require their signatures for the passport. So all of these things, if the relationship breaks down and people want to spite each other, there's a denial of giving consent to those things. So, and women hear the story, so they go, I don't want those future problems, so I'm not going to put them on the birth certificate, because it
Mhm.
becomes impossible for any of those things to happen. And I think those are unintentional barriers, but that
Mhm.
is a major contribution to fathers' names being omitted on birth certificates. So
Gotcha.
that's easy to say, well, I'm not on the birth certificate, so I can't be the biological father. And because I'm not acknowledged, I'm not going to pay.
Hmm. Okay. It's quite a very tragic domino effect, right?
Well, there's so many intersections that we have to understand the complexities if we really want to shift from one blaming the other, because that's where it appears we
Right.
are stuck, is we blame each other and we just blame the breakdown of relationships. But it is a lot more complex, and in the absence of that, we're not going to dig deeper, which is what you're doing, is to look at some of the root causes so that we can understand, because with understanding, we can start changing the way that we view this. Because if you shift from the mothers being spiteful to, well, I can understand the barriers, so that move that out the way. That if there is, because if and just for the sake of this conversation and due to the
Yeah.
stats, so if the father shows up consistently as a social father, a present father post relationship, the mother would have no objections of at a later stage including him on the birth certificate. But so that's important.
Okay. That's very useful perspective, because to the point is, it's also, at least in the echo rooms of social media, right? It's also very easy for fathers to talk about maintenance from a standpoint of, she's trying to extort money from me, etc., etc. But in the opening, you very clearly outlined the fact that it's not like she, thumbs up a figure that he must pay. There's a proper evaluation and an assessment, right? So I think, at least from my experience, the when you talk the maintenance word, it's always for men sometimes perceived as oh, okay, this one was just a gold digger, right? And the courts will always
Yeah.
side with men and all that kind of stuff, and it's clearly not as simplistic as that. Um, and on this point, one of the things I want to quote from the research in this. It says enforcing child maintenance payments should therefore be prioritized by the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. If the South African government were to better enforce child maintenance payments, it would go some way in achieving their commitment to alleviating poverty by 2030, and also tackle a form of abuse. So, based on that, my question to you would be, from what you've seen, from what government has implemented or is trying to implement, has there been any traction? Right, because if the starting point is, the child is not on the birth certificate, how will they even enforce? Right, trying to ensure that these maintenance orders for the woman that's actually in the process. We haven't even discussed the ones that don't even know that that process is there.
So let's start from the point of you're in the process.
Right.
I think that there has been an improvement from the Department of Justice, not enough. And we see that in the amendments to the Child Maintenance Act that discussion paper from 2021. So there are measures, for example, like not just being able to attach pensions, but more robust ways. Because let's be honest, criminalizing maintenance defaulters is not the way to go. And if we look at the American system, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the American system, most of the men that are incarcerated are African Americans, and due to child support, because it's tracked through, there's much better tracking. So if you're arrested for a DV offense, for example, they will pick up that you're in arrears with maintenance, and they will immediately lock you up, incarcerate you, and your bail is your arrears maintenance. So, I mean, you can imagine in this country, our jails are already full with hardened criminals, and now to criminalize that is one, we don't have the capacity, and it's not the solution. I do agree with that, but we have to have more enforceable measures that really act as a deterrent. But I still, and the research of my group shows us that most mothers, if their children are born out of marriage, will try and get some kind of informal agreement in place.
Right.
So there are many instances where fathers are paying voluntarily small amounts inconsistently, and we'll go into that now. And it's through the inconsistency of payments that women eventually go, I'm now going to approach the court, because this is not sustainable.
Right.
And an interesting thing happens at that point is because often men say, and in that State of Fatherhood report, it's actually mentioned in there, the moment the court gets involved and has to determine it, it seems to be resisted by men, having somebody else coming in, telling them how much of their money to spend where. And there's a resistance to that. So we see it often where they go, do not go to maintenance court, because if you go to maintenance court, I'm going to stop paying altogether. So let's move on from that. So if somebody says that, if you do something that I don't want you to do, there is going to be a negative consequence. That takes us into the realm of abuse, because that is coercive controlling behavior. So if you don't do it, then I will reward you. And if you do it, I'm going to punish you in some way. And that punishment is I'm going to withhold the child support to punish you because you want to drag me to court. And there's a lot of misconception around that as well, because some men seem to believe that once there's a court order, it affects your employment. It becomes a negative thing on your record, which is not true. Nobody's aware that there's a court order against you. So it has no negative implications unless you intend to violate that court order. Then, of course, you could be charged criminally. And then, yes, you will get a record. But that's in the extreme.
I think
so. Again, just to elaborate on the abuse part, so we even see, and this is, I think it's important for people to understand. It is so nuanced, Lindile, because if you are the father of my child and you are paying me maintenance every month, okay, but you're supposed to pay it by the 30th, but you don't always pay it on the 30th. So 1 month you'll pay it on the 30th. The next month you might pay it on the 7th. The next month you might pay it on the 3rd. Okay, so the only recourse I have against that is to go to court and ask them for a garnishee order because you're not consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, there are no consequences to that. But the impacts of that behavior are again. So you don't pay me on the 30th. I'm going to ring you on the 1st and go, hey, like, where's the money for the kids? And you're going to go, don't nag me. I will pay you when I feel like paying you.
Right.
So that again now becomes a form of abuse. So then you go, okay, well, 3 days later, you're desperate, you haven't got food, your money has all gone. My money is now gone to, the fixed expenses, and all we need now is to buy food, for example, from your contribution, because I've used my money for the other expenses. Now I can't buy food. So now I'm getting desperate. So day 3, day 4, I'm going to be scared to message you because I know that you're going to verbally attack me. So eventually, out of desperation, I phone you again or I message you and you go, I told you not to. I will pay you when I want to pay you.
Got you.
Or you say, don't contact me, contact my girlfriend or contact my new wife because she manages the expenses. So that you
Yeah.
can see, so and this happens very, very often. This is not anecdotal. This is not a one-off. This is something that happens on a regular basis. So that's where people aren't aware that it becomes a form of abuse because again, that's controlling. You have a legal obligation to pay by a certain date. So why don't you just do it? Why
Right.
don't you just do it? Just do
And,
it
and that's the
because of these
frustrating
other
thing.
impacts.
Yeah. I mean, it's your child.
And that is sure. So if we look at this, the intersection with fathering, so that happens on a continuous basis. What does that do for the relationship between the two parents? One, the children become aware of it because it's very difficult for the primary parent to go, well, I haven't got food because your father hasn't paid. Okay. So trying to protect your children, if you don't say that, the children think you're bad
Mm,
parent. So a
mm,
lot of the time, the primary parent will go, it's because the other parent hasn't paid. So what that does to the child is go, well, does my father not care that we're hungry? And overhearing conversations between the mother and father, then the child goes, I'm the cause of these problems. Maybe I shouldn't have been born. And that starts affecting the relationship between the child and the parent.
mm.
Because incorrectly so, mothers then eventually go, well, if you can't pay for the children, I'm not going to allow you access to the children, which is incorrect because there's two different legislations that cover that. Parenting and maintenance are separate. You cannot use one against the other, offset one against the other. You have to go through the courts. So if you've been denied access to your child, you need to approach the children's court. If the mother's saying you're not paying, um, you're entitled to approach the children's court because it should not impact on the relationship. That's from a legal point of view. But I'm explaining realistically what happens. So then the father goes, oh, well, I'm sick and tired of talking to you because it's always a big fight. And then they start creating distance between themselves and their children. And that information is also in the State of Fatherhood report. The other interesting thing in that report shows that when men are unemployed and unable to provide, it affects their self esteem and how they are viewed as a man. And
Right.
they then start distancing themselves because they don't feel that they are now providing and protecting their children. And the shame around that, they start withdrawing from being a social parent.
Got you. There's one thing based on what you said that I'd like to, because that the I'm withholding your children or access to your children because you've not paid maintenance is typically what we hear anecdotally, right? About,
Mm.
oh, she's withholding my children from me, and as you've explained, it's two separate issues and two separate processes. Now, my question, in so far as the state is concerned, is the footprint of family courts and children's courts where these issues can be addressed proportional to the scale of the problem that we have in the country. So, do women basically do that because they honestly feel like there's no other recourse in terms of a children's court or family court that they can go to.
There is a bit of that. There definitely is a bit of that.
Okay.
And unfortunately, there is an intersection. And I think what is missing in our family courts is because they work in silos and they shouldn't be. They should be talking to each other. So if you have an application in the maintenance court, there should be a copy of that in your application at children's court. So there is perspective because we need social intervention. Okay. And so if and either or, so if both courts have a proper understanding of what the dynamics and what is going on, then this is where social development should come in and social workers should intervene to prevent this from escalating and to try and retain or to repair family bonds.
And on that, maybe in the work that you've done with the Ministry of Women, Children, and People with Disabilities, are you seeing at least there's a move towards this integration that's needed? Because as a layperson, so I don't have children, I'm not married, so I'm as we're talking in as a layperson, I'm like, okay, great. Part of what the responsibility of this ministry should be is exactly that, right? So my question to you then is, are you seeing with the creation of this ministry and its mandate that's happening in terms of being able to integrate that, or are we still maybe in the infancy of that utopia that we need to get to?
Yeah, we definitely don't see it. In fact, those are some of the most vulnerable primary parents, is because, and again, look, I have a special needs child, so I do understand this as well.
Right.
There's this thing where only 30% of marriages and relationships last when there's a special needs child,
Hmm.
and understandably so, because it puts additional pressure on the relationship because of the needs. Um, so particularly where there is an unnatural amount of care work for a disabled child, and that normally falls onto the mother. So she's unable to be economically active
Right.
because she is parenting the special needs child. And if the father doesn't acknowledge or is present in a special needs child's life and doesn't financially contribute, the impact on the primary parent is
Yeah.
horrendous because
Yeah.
they are then completely dependent on a social grant, on the child grant, on the disability grant. She's unable to be economically active.
Right.
So you kind of become pretty much trapped in a cycle of poverty, because how do you get out of that? And we do not have sufficient social services or social security to be able to support these parents. And often we see, in order for the primary parent to go and become economically active, these children are placed with grandparents who themselves have like are stuck in that cycle. They move to a different province, and that responsibility then falls on the extended family. Um, yeah, we
Um,
got a lot of work to do with regards to that.
you mentioned at the beginning your interest in studying behavior, right?
Mm.
And how the behavior is consistent. And one of the things that I wanted to pick your brain on, and I'll quote a behavior based quote from the report you contributed to State of Fatherhood. It says many fathers apparently also use lockdown restrictions as an excuse not to attend court or to pay maintenance. According to members of the CMDCSA group, the DOG and CD itself did not seem to assist on the matter, perpetuating injustice and passively allowing the abuse to continue by not resolving unpaid maintenance garnished for up to 7 months. Mothers who approached the department for assistance reported in the group that they were often told that the computer system was down and were offered no resolution. The DOJ and CD eventually released a press statement after some pressures from CSOs and the press stating that their system had crashed at the end of May 2020. However, the delays in payment had started prior, to the alleged system crash. So what it sounds to me like is, yes, during lockdown, everything came to a halt, and from a behavioral standpoint, fathers that knew that they had an obligation to pay maintenance took advantage of this. But what it also sounds like is there's also has been some kind of enablement from the state, right? Even prior to this, to not drive the enforcement of payment of maintenance. And from the discussions that you've had, what would your thoughts be around the complex root causes of the enablers of this behavior, both from fathers in not paying and also in our state sort of, dragging its feet? Because as we're going to get to it later, there is quantification of what is the cost to our economy by having, abused children and all of this kind of stuff.
Correct. So on that, funny enough that you bring that up, because this in May there was there was a security breach on the IT system at the Department of Justice, and since 2020 I've been monitoring this because of the problems experienced back in 2020. I'll give you one example. A mother, it took 7 years to get a maintenance order. Okay, she eventually got a garnishee order, and the very first month that the father's salary was garnished, there was a security breach, which was last month. So what it appears as though it was an internal breach, but they immediately suspended child maintenance. So in this situation where the father is paying, okay, so the father is not at fault here, but the system is the problem. And one, I don't understand why they're doing a third-party payment system. They should be doing direct debit orders. And because it leaves itself vulnerable. This is not the first cyber attack or will be the last one. And it doesn't only happen in the judiciary. So from their perspective is they need to look at the barriers or future barriers or potential problems that would impact on them. But in this recent breach, I was notified the next day that the money did not come through. So 12 hours later, I then approached the department and asked them, is there another security breach? Because I'd seen more than one complaints or questions going, I've not received my money. Which eventually they didn't respond. So I then approached the media and the media contacted them. They then issued a press release saying that there had been a security breach. What they did do is said, go to courts and collect your money from the courts. I mean, that's just been a nightmare for most beneficiaries because some don't live in the same provinces. The one mother, for example, is wheelchair bound and lives in Mdatsani, and for her to get to East London is almost impossible. They have no money. Children couldn't get to school to write exams because they didn't have transport money. And the department's simplistic solution of go to court or we're working on the system or we apologize doesn't deal with the real impacts because there's a lack of communication and understanding of the impacts. So from a structure and a systemic point of view, there really needs to be a greater understanding of impacts of these systems, which they are kind of addressing, but not enough and not quick enough, because then we hear about budget cuts, which immediately we know is going to impact on rollouts. Yeah. But, we have to keep lobbying against that. And then to speak to some of the behaviors, there's some very disturbing things that come up for me because I say, and we see this, when people are in relationship, there is a understanding, you both are contributing, you know what the children's expenses are because you're spending that money every month, whether you are cohabiting or you're married. So children's school fees, how much they eat, leisure, whatever, clothing. But suddenly when parents separate, and we see this even if people have been married for 15 years, the same argument comes up, but the child doesn't cost that much. Suddenly there seems to be amnesia, of how much children cost. And that's why it's important to use scientific data, because if we look at the food abject poverty baseline now, is 725 Rand per month per person. And that is just sufficient nutritional value for bodily function. That is not to get up and go to school or to go to work. That is literally to get up and go to the toilet and to breathe.
Right.
And that's abject food poverty. So when we see like on the group, you see like orders of 500 Rand a month, and they go, but you get a social grant. What the child grant is like what 480 Rand a month, or 410 Rand. It might be 430 Rand now. Even if you. How does that, plus your 500 Rand that you're getting for maintenance, is less than 800 Rand? That is just above abject food poverty. What about education? What about clothing? What about shelter? So I think that we also need, and that's where the thing sort of comes in as like a gold digger. And let's be honest, this is a very diverse country. There are parents that earn in excess of 100,000 Rand a month that live in luxury estates, and they can afford to send their kids to private schools. So if I'm getting, and we see this in the press, like if I'm getting maintenance of 85,000 Rand a month, it doesn't mean I'm a gold digger. It means that is the lifestyle that the children and I were accustomed to. So, and our Divorce Act speaks to maintaining children in a standard of living that they're accustomed to. But that is extreme. I mean, so let's look at the majority of people. Where we have such high unemployment, unemployment speaks to more women being unemployed, women earn less than men. And we look at the poverty, and then the latest stats that came out where it's showing us an increase in malnutrition. That when I hear that particularly fathers and some men and some women going, well, women are just having money for their social grant, or they're using their social grant on themselves, I'm going, okay, so how many of our children are actually dying from malnutrition?
Interesting.
To support that argument.
Right.
Because, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm not saying we don't have problem parents, who are spending their money on alcohol and drugs, and that's another social ill altogether. But if we look at the majority, the money is going on their children. But it is assumed that if particularly if a mother is not employed, that she cannot have her hair done, she cannot have her nails done, she cannot dress well, because it's automatically assumed that money should be for the children, but it could be gifted by family members or friends or bartering. But there's this, so the moment that a woman looks good, there's an assumption that she's using the child's money.
Yeah, got you.
And I go, it's crazy for me, because we should have far more children dying from malnutrition if that was the case. Fathers are not contributing enough. So when we look at that, so women are carrying the bulk of it. 60% of women are getting not a cent. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to understand the impact of that on economic equality of women in this country.
Very good. 100%. I mean, I think even in the report, as you mentioned, some of the causes of what they call, there's a term for it, the VAC, violence against children. Malnutrition doesn't show up as the as the top reason, right? In the very same report. And in fact, quite conversely, it talks about how if we were to solve for this, and I'll quote, it says the researchers estimated a series of reductions if different types of violence were prevented. This is specifically violence against children. That serious mental illness could decline by 10% in the entire population. Anxiety and alcohol abuse could decline by 13% in the entire population. Drug abuse could decline by 11% in the entire population. And it goes on and on and on and on. So it's as we discussed earlier, it's a very layered and complex thing. And one of the things I wanted to talk about as part of where we are as a country is our understanding of the impact of violence, right? And so one of the things that the paper touches on is about the fact that in this country, and I want to quote, United Nations data shows that the global rate of intentional homicide is about 6 per 100,000 in 2012 and 2017. In contrast, the rate of such homicide in South Africa is in 2012 was around 31 per 100,000. So it's about like 6 times the global average, roughly, and nearly 36 per 100,000 in 2017. And if we compare a comparative country that's poorer than South Africa, it says the murder rate in Burkina Faso in 2012 was approximately 0.7 per 100,000. So, to put it in a nutshell for our viewers, what's basically happening is this murder rate, homicide rate, is disproportionately in this country affecting young men, particularly black and colored, if we're going to call a spade a spade. And these are the men that are the very potentially the fathers that we're talking about. So that shifts me to sort of say, in the statistically unlikely event, based on what we discussed, that this young black man or young colored man actually is on the birth certificate, right? And then maybe there wasn't a formal marriage, and he ends up getting murdered, which is likely the case based on these violent stats. Where does that leave uh, the mother, and what's your experience in those cases, even if they've been married and there's maybe not a will, etc.? What does that process look like?
So it would normally go to the paternal mother,
Mm-hmm.
but anybody, because that's the norm in this country. But if, for example, the paternal mother's family is unable to, there's nothing stopping the paternal father's family from putting in an application and to have guardianship. Again, a social worker would be allocated. If the children are not in a safe place, the state would take them in and put them into a safe space until the court has decided where the children need to go to. Um, and that's why I say it's so difficult,
Right.
because if mothers and fathers, if we could realize that post relationship, that we have a joint responsibility
Yeah.
and we're able to put our differences aside for the best interest of the child, that would be ideal. But we have to acknowledge in this country that historically we have a traumatized country because of apartheid,
Right.
and what particularly men of color, particularly black men,
Mhm.
experience, and of what violence is and how normalized violence was.
Right.
And also migrant labor, if we take migrant labor into it,
Yeah.
how that really disrupted family units and nuclear families. And the research shows us that was really where the fatherless nation really started,
Right.
was through migrant labor. So we need to take all of that into account. But so while there is this context to everything, we have to acknowledge that that we are a traumatized nation, and that I think it's incumbent on all of us. We live in a patriarchal world still, where men are seen as head of households and decision makers. That where unresolved trauma is not dealt with, it is going to come out in their personal relationships. And and until we address that, we are not going to see a change in co-parenting, and we're not going to see a change in like maintenance payments, the increase in child crime, um, and vulnerability to drugs and gangsterism and all of that stuff. And often on that, they go, oh, well, it must be the women's fault because, the primary parents are mainly women. They're not doing a good enough job, and that's why these kids are going all wayward. But we are the male role models to do that. But it's just like it's exhausting for women to keep going to maintenance court. I've coached many men as well who go, I'm ready to walk away from the process and give up on my relationship with my children because it is so labor intensive. It is so emotionally and psychologically draining that I'd rather walk away because I can't cope anymore.
Yeah.
And that is the cry for help from both mothers and
Yeah.
fathers. Going, there are these structural and systemic barriers that are contributing to it. But without seeing it for what it is, we then blame each other. And the crazy thing is there is such a divide, and you just have to look at social media under like a maintenance post, particularly the comments. I mean, I've read comments under there like, go and hire a hitman from KZN. He'll get rid of your problem. Or go employ a good tax consultant who will hide all of your money. And we see, and that is telling us what our social ills are. Why are we ignoring that? So one, again, DSD needs to get more involved here because we need intervention. In the absence of that, we're going to see an escalation. And another thing is because of the economic inequality, women are choosing abuse over poverty. If a woman leaves an abusive relationship and she goes to family or to a shelter, without some kind of social security when she comes out of that, 3 months later, because somebody else needs that space because we've got such high levels of physical violence, the woman ends up going back to her abuser.
Right.
And for women who are killed, when we look at our femicide figures, there has been a history of this. But because of the economic dependence, they go back. So that's an intervention point. It's an intervention point on both sides.
And I know, Felicity, in your work, you've probably interacted a lot more with, obviously, because we're talking maintenance. I'd like your insights on the state of mind and state of being of the children, right? Because whatever they experience, and in some of the violent stuff that I quoted in terms of effect on children, is it's basically like we're repeating the same cycle. So have you seen at least green shoots of hope that despite that might have been the context that they grew up in, that they are not going to repeat the same cycle based on what they've seen? What have some new observations been around that?
So troubling for me is that single mothering has been glamorized and glorified, because I, particularly in the media, like people who have a big social presence, they say, I was raised by a single mother. Like, I mean, she was amazing. She like a superwoman. And then they go and do exactly the same thing. They go and do exactly the same thing. And then I go, okay, so what happened here? Because you're on the receiving end of this. You saw what your mother went through. You're glorifying her, but now you're doing exactly the same thing. What is the cognitive dissonance at that point that you cannot see that you are perpetuating this? We need to have those kind of discussions, because I think a lot of it is just so normalized that it's done unconsciously. And I think we need to be conscientized, and we need to be prepared to have these uncomfortable discussions. I'm not saying women are blamed. I mean, I'm not blaming men and I'm not blaming women. I look at the research, at the data, at people's lived experiences, and things are what they are.
Right.
And yes, we've said it so many times, they're complex, they're layered.
Yep.
But if we want to change all of this, we need to be brave enough to have these conversations and put them on the table. The one thing that I do take heart of or from is shows like yours and other movements where by men, for men, to challenge toxic masculinity, because toxic masculinity hurts men as well as hurts women and children. And yes, women are great minions for patriarchy, so women are not exempted from this because they get rewarded. So we need to understand this, and we need to deconstruct it, and we really have an opportunity now to do something different. I sat in on the release of a report by Equity One a couple of weeks ago, where the research was about the inequality in family law in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that it will take 288 years to address the gendered inequality in family law in Africa. And that addresses things like genital mutilation, child's brides, divorces, co-parenting. The one thing that they did omit was maintenance, which I was horrified
Yeah.
about. But and that is frightening. Those are startling figures for us to digest. We can change that. We can change
Yeah,
that.
we have to. I don't think it's a at this point for me it's not even an optional. It's a compulsory. And on that, one of the things I also wanted
Yeah.
to get a sense of from you is you mentioned earlier about having had conversations with fathers in the work that you've done, um, and based on the conversation that you've had with them, I'd like you to share what are some of the insights that have touched you in terms of the levels of introspection and reflection that gives you hope that we actually can turn the tide around. Because as you mentioned, it's not for me. I also am in the same camp that it's not even a sort of blame game of men, women, etc. We're all in this together, right? And each person,
Mm.
each role needs to play their part. So, what are some of those reflections and insights that have given you some glimmer of hope?
Um, Well, I think there's been an increase of awareness through various things and also lived experience. One is that parents are going, despite the fact that there's no financial contribution, that I facilitated and encouraged a good relationship with the father. We definitely, I mean, there's a fair amount of that, and also where fathers are saying, although we have all of this litigation going on in children's court and she's not allowing me to see the children, I'm still fulfilling my monthly obligation,
Right.
because that shows that, they're trying to protect their children and provide for their children, because it's the right thing to do, and, that they don't want to cause harm on their children. So those are very encouraging, not enough.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think there's also a lot of social intervention, which is great to deal with root causes. Yeah, and hopefully, like the various government departments will really start playing catch up and and take their part in this more seriously.
Right. Right. Well, with that, I would like to thank you, first of all, for the work that you're doing, and bringing clearly to light for all of us the very layered and structural issues we have when it comes to this issue of fatherhood, more specifically on maintenance. I hope that our conversation, as we do the public screening and have public discussions, first of all, gives a lot more awareness to it, and the men and women that do watch our conversation um, can first of all challenge themselves and have these conversations with others. We in social media, it's very easy to say, we're going to break generational curses and stuff. It's great to say, but we actually need to do the difficult
Yeah.
and uncomfortable work in, first of all, having the conversations and changing our behavior ultimately. So, thank you so much for your time, Felicity, and looking forward to more of the great work that you'll be doing.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for what you're doing. Like, huge respect. Thank you.
Thank you.